Shock Piece: The Search for Freedom. A novel by C. Nguyen. Chapter 31. The Bus Trip. "We're going to get out of the country at last," Kim whispered. "Oh, I love the suspense. It's stimulating." Trin rolled her eyes upwards, stretched her arms against her sides, and pretended to give her body a free fall backward for a moment, then breathed in deeply, steadying her balance. They both giggled quietly, easing the tension a little. They could not risk being discovered and were very jumpy, but they were excited at the same time. The apprehension of traveling to Kangter and dodging many inspection stations to reach their rendezvous was electrifying. They had never been in a situation like this before, unlike others who had failed after several attempts and ended up in jail. Careful planning and all, James Bond style or not, how plain it was in the end, because even though they had started the journey separately from home, leaving in groups of two in half-hour intervals by different transports, they all ended up on the same bus, traveling the same route. In hindsight, Trin smiled at the simplicity of their thinking at that time. An acute observer would have guessed that there was something unusual going on, coincidentally, without knowing it, and despite efforts to pretend to be peasants going about their normal daily lives. More than half the passengers on that early morning commercial bus were going to be on the same trip and had the same goal: escape to the sea. Out of the total 50 passengers, 30 were in the plan. The bus was bringing them to Kangter, a provincial city 100 kilometers to the southwest of Saigon, as the departure port. They all looked out of place and were shy in their outfits, with the clean, pale skin unmistakably typical of city girls and women, not the harsh, weather-beaten, dark, leathery skin that most peasants had. Mother sat a few rows in front with Trin. Kim and V were at the back. They pretended not to know each other or any other passengers on the bus. Every time the bus stopped at an inspection station, Mother began to worry. Before it came to a complete standstill, Mother turned and eyed the sisters silently, discreetly signaling for them to stay quiet by putting her finger to her lips. "Don't talk, Trin," she whispered, firing a string of successive don'ts. "Don't look at them, the guards or the officers. Look away or down at your feet. Do not let them see your face. Don't let them suspect anything, child, and don't fidget about." She squeezed her hand lightly in encouragement. None of them had obtained any permit, and if caught by the inspector without the official paper, then they would all be doomed. Trin nodded her head quietly and snuggled closer to her mother, wishing they had already arrived. Sitting in the crowded bus, they had passed 2 inspection stations already. It would take at least another 3 hours at this rate. Trin sighed heavily. The guards were looking for escapees and peddlers with prohibited goods. Since 1978, when the exodus of boat people began, traveling had become even more challenging than before. Travelers had to obtain permits to go distances as short as a kilometer if he or she was to stay overnight at that destination. Similarly, unless with an authorized permit, transporting anything was prohibited by the Vietnamese Communist government after the war ended. The smuggler was considered a black market peddler, even for as little as 5 kilos of meat or 10 kilos of rice. So much so for rules and intricate patterns of authoritative layers of the communist system. However, with bribes, everything was possible. The profits from exploiting the escapees and black market peddlers attracted the guards and officers at every inspection station. With the pretext of reinforcing security measures and collectivism, the authority at each local station had enormous power to terrorize the travelers. Their eagerness to earn extra income from solicited bribes or confiscated goods encouraged them to be vigilant in their duties. Luckily, their bus passed the last 2 stations in peak hour traffic. The line of vehicles waiting for inspection seemed to trend about a kilometer long, and the guards were so busy they were waving vehicles through to speed up the process. The bus dodged inspection by sheer luck, a relief for all of them. However, at the last station, they would have to be searched. Drin knew that and waited in apprehension when the bus slowed down to a full stop. "Everyone get off the bus for inspection," the young driver's assistant yelled at the top of his voice over the chattering of his passengers. "Leave all your belongings on the bus, folks." This was going to be a big test, Drin thought. Would they be all right? Would they be able to avoid the guard's suspicion? How would she cope if she were in jail? Who was going to visit her if all their family members were caught? Would her friends know? Who would write to her? Mother squeezed her hands and signaled the sisters as previously, jerking Trin out of her scenarios. She had to put on a mask of calmness, and Trin heard her mantra chanting under her breath. The passengers got slowly off the bus. Many showed their nervousness clearly. Their eyes fluttered and their steps wavered. Some girls were clinging tightly to their mothers. Waiting for her turn and having something to occupy her mind with, Drin counted roughly 50 passengers on the small bus. The majority were female. Some were middle-aged, some were over 50, and there were a few young women and teenagers like him and her. Drin then made a quick calculation in her head. Only the 3 old men among them, with the driver and his assistant, brought the percentage of males to females to 10%. Perhaps most men were still in re-education camps, the girl reflected. "Come on, hurry up, folks, we haven't got all day," the middle-aged driver urged, yelling from his front seat. He was getting impatient. His bus was behind schedule, and he hated that. He boasted to his passengers of always being on time. "Damn it, no time for me to visit my mistress before going home tonight," he mumbled to himself. "Bloody hell." All the passengers were edgy. G knew that it was not because they had something to hide, but because there were no rights or laws to protect them. Their fate depended very much on the whims of the local officers and guards, the ultimate arbiters of the law. Anyone wearing a uniform or displaying a badge was enough to terrify people. Local rules and state rules were sometimes only remotely related. A permit carrying a stamp from one town might be meaningless in another. That terrified people more as uniforms could transform the wearers into godlike figures at any time, any day. Consequently, the fear of authority was indescribable. Anyone could be accused of a crime at any time without a chance of offering a legitimate defense. That feeling of terror from authority stayed with G and other Vietnamese in her generation for many years later on. Drin noticed that a pretty young woman, 2 rows down from her, was reluctant to leave the vehicle. She was looking uneasily at the 2 large hampers underneath her seat. A small child perched skillfully on her hips, leaning to one side. Drin could also see that she was flustered. Her steps were slow and her face ashen. The little boy was whimpering softly. His feet were bare and he was wearing colorful home-sewn boxer shorts that were much larger than his skinny chicken legs. The fading cream shirt was crudely sewn, with the last 2 buttons missing, exposing his big belly and prolapsed belly button. The distended belly was out of proportion with his bony ribcage, an indication of threadworm infestation, playing detective, Drin deduced. But the prolapsed navel might also be the result of excessive crying from constant hunger and neglect, Drin concluded with satisfaction, observing the mother and child. "Hurry up, woman," the driver urged, jerking mother and child down the steps. She was the last one to get off the bus. Her collarless cotton blouse was plain gray, with sewed-on square pockets on both sides. Her black satin pajama pants were now charcoal from many washes and wears over the years. On her feet was a pair of black thongs, with dark gray straps, the heels wafer-thin. She was wearing a conical palm leaf hat on her head and a gray chin strap that matched her blouse, with part of her hair showing under the hat. Overall, it was the typical dress of the peasant in this part of the South. Even though her clothes were plain and showed signs of wear and tear, the young woman still looked tidy and self-respecting. The young guard in the light green army uniform, carrying an AK-47 on his shoulder, was standing next to the inspector ready to board the bus. The inspector was a middle-aged man. His uniform was of the same color as the guards, with 2 yellow stars sewn onto red fabric on either side of his shirt collar. He stepped onto the vehicle without a smile, a small baton held behind his back. On his feet were the open-toed rubber sandals, typical footwear of the North Vietnamese army, showing chipped fungal infected nails that were black and deformed. His face was cold and harsh, as if being friendly would not show off his power to create the fear he wished to instill. He walked slowly toward the back of the bus, poking into hampers and luggage beneath the passengers' seats. "Whose hampers are these?" Suddenly his voice boomed. He motioned to the young guard to pull out the 2 large hampers belonging to the young woman with the little boy. He was very pleased with his detection. Aha! He would show them who was in charge here. 3 years had passed since he was stationed here, and still he could not shake off the inferiority complex he had with Southerners. They always made him feel small just by their gaze. How peculiar that was. Never mind, at least there was something here today, he told himself. The whole morning, up and down, there had been many buses without any reward, and he was not amused. Damn those cunning Southerners. They were getting smarter every day. They knew how to hide their goods and cheat him. It was harder to catch them now, stupid low-life peasants. But look at those hampers. Beneath the tattered clothes and bunches of sugar bananas were the treasures he craved. Prohibited goods were meager amounts. 10 kilograms of rice, 1 kilogram of pork, 2 kilograms of brown cane sugar, 20 or so loose cigarettes. That was enough to be charged as a profiteer trading in prohibited goods, and for the goods to be confiscated on the spot. The offender could face severe beatings and days, weeks, or months in detention without trial. Few might escape their fate by bribing officers. However, the bribe might be more than the value of their goods, and so some peddlers just preferred to abandon them to avoid beatings and detention. "Whose goods are these?" He repeated his question, his voice booming louder this time, several decibels louder and even angrier. No one dared to speak up. Mother held Trin's hand tightly. The dampness of her sweat made their grip slippery and clammy. But Trin did not try to break away. She was afraid of any movement that might draw attention to them. She leaned against her mother for protection and peered through the gaps of the crowd. Mother understood the woman's dilemma, as she had been caught under similar circumstances a few months before, with 5 kilograms of rice brought back home for the family in Saigon. Luckily, she was released on the spot, as the driver had befriended the inspector on many occasions before. He was her cousin and had helped her out, with bribery, of course. However, she knew that was a narrow escape, as she could have faced the same misfortune as this young woman. "Where did you find them, comrade officer?" The driver stepped up and asked tentatively. He wanted to get on with his trip and get out of here as quickly as possible. They were late already, and he did not want to be held responsible to his boss. "At row number 10 in the middle seat. Do you know who they belong to, driver?" The driver hesitated, holding his breath for a split second before pointing his index finger to the young woman. He had made up his mind. Worse luck, he felt very sorry for her, but he also had his job to do. His family was dependent on him, and he could not delay the bus a moment longer. He needed to find a culprit quickly to clear out of here. There was no time for him to sympathize with anyone. After the driver identified the young woman, her face turned as white as a corpse underneath her conical hat. Her whole body shook uncontrollably, causing the child on her hips to shake with the same movement. Sensing something terrible was going to happen, the boy started wailing with fright. She tried to calm her son by whispering into his ear, albeit unsuccessfully, as she was already terrified herself. "Hush, don't cry, son. Don't cry, baby," she choked. Sensing his mother's distress, the child bawled even louder with all his might. The woman put her son down on the ground, almost throwing him off her hips, as if unable to bear her burden any longer. However, she threw herself down onto him, wrapping him into her arms and immediately regretting her prior action. Helplessly, she glanced at her wailing son, lost in her sorrow. not knowing what to do next. She then looked up at the officer, tears flowing freely down her high cheekbones. Please, officer, please take whatever you desire, but let me go. I have 3 other children at home, and they have no one else to care for them. Their father is in a re-education camp, and I'm their sole carer. This is my first time. I swear I'll never do it again. Please, please, sir. Be kind and be generous. Let me go. Please don't hold me back. Don't put me in detention. My children will be so scared if I am not home with them tonight. I'm so desperate to earn some money for the family. That is all I have. Please take it. She hesitated, then continued decisively, even knowing that she had no way to repay the loan for the cost of her goods. Please take them all, but let me go, please. Still, kneeling on the ground with her hands clasped together, she begged him and cried harder, bowing her head, kowtowing on the ground in a pitiful gesture. Indifferent and unperturbed by the wailing figure on the ground, the inspector walked toward her, using his baton to flick the hat off her head. The chin strap caught, making him repeat his action. It was comical, regardless of the woman's dire situation, and some kids sniggered, making him even more furious. In the end, he jerked her hat off forcibly with his hand and trampled on it irritably. Damn it! How dare you trade goods without a license? It's unforgivable, and you even pretended to be a mother with children. You ought to know that the transport of food is prohibited, especially rice, meat, and cigarettes. You're bringing them to the rebels, aren't you? After barking his string of charges, releasing his temper satisfactorily, he looked carefully at the woman. Whoa, whoa, what have we got here? Good golly, she is a pretty one. This is getting better, he muttered under his breath, feeling his excitement building. It was promising. He could have done something here to ease his tension. It had been a while since he had a woman for a victim. Smacking his lips, he inhaled deeply, thinking he could smell her pungent aroma, anticipating the pleasure the woman would bring. Then, imagining his fingers circling around her nipples, he was delightedly aware of his hardening penis rising in his trousers. Without a moment to lose, he turned to the driver and gave him the signal for the bus to move along without the woman, her son, and the hampers. The young woman turned frantic. She cried and begged even louder, knowing that her fate was sealed for the meager amount of food in her possession. The prospect of punishment she had to face was horrifying. The woman gathered the boy back into her arms as if she could use his undernourished, pitiful body as a buffer, protecting her from the terrifying experience she was about to endure. She would have no money left to purchase a ticket home to her family after her interrogation session with the guards at the station and their bribes. She would probably have to trade her pride to be able to return home tonight. The young woman stared desperately at the departing bus. Her eyes followed its trail with anguish. The passengers on board had not dared to interfere. Everyone averted their gaze and was very glad that it was not them who had this bad luck. In the bottom of her heart, Drin knew that they had the woman and her child to thank for their escape.